we are going to go ahead and get things started. Happy St. Patrick's Day, everybody. Good afternoon. And my name is Trinity Korth. I'm the Financial Services Solution Advisor for the Center for Professional and Executive Development. I'm excited to have you with us today to hear from Tracy Nelson. I would like to mention that today's webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be made available within the next few days. Before I introduce Tracy, I'd like to share a few words about the Wisconsin School Business Center for Professional and Executive Development, also known as CPED. The Center for Professional and Executive Development offers programs and certificates that will give you the modern, relevant skills needed to advance your career. All of our programs offer interactive live learning sessions facilitated by instructors with practical business experience. CPED also partners with organizations and associations like yours to provide customized professional development programs, coaching, and consulting. For more information, please visit our website at uwcped.org. Now I'd like to hand it over to Tracy Nelson, who will be leading today's webinar. Tracy has worked with CPED for about 8 years, where she has overseen leadership programs and worked closely with clients to develop high-impact leadership development initiatives. She specializes in helping leaders cultivate emotional intelligence skills and is also a trusted talent advisor, partnering with organizations to optimize their talent strategies and address critical talent needs. In addition to leading leadership development programs and coaching leaders, Tracy works directly with clients to ensure their talent strategies drive business success. And for today, if you guys have any questions that come up, please drop those in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll be sure to review those. And any that we aren't able to get today, we'll try to get out some answers through the blog that will be coming out later with this. Okay, Tracy, it's all yours.
Sounds good. Thank you, Trinity, and welcome, everyone. It's great to have you here for today's session. We all know that the financial services industry and all industries really are evolving at an unprecedented pace right now. AI is really shaking things up as we're learning how to leverage it for data and number crunching, tracking and reporting, automating tasks, and guiding our decisions. The use of AI is really everywhere and it's growing, but at the end of the day, business is still about people. And the need to interact effectively with team members of varied backgrounds, different levels of experience, different personality styles, different communication styles, different work styles, and more. Really, the best leaders and financial services leaders are able to work within this new paradigm that we're in to leverage advanced technologies while still getting things done through people by building trust and influence, navigating uncertainty, and leading with impact. And at the heart of these things is the skill of emotional intelligence, and I call it your superpower in the age of AI. There's still a lot of leadership programs being done to ready leaders for the future of work that are focusing more on technical know-how rather than the human skills that can really help move the needle. So what makes EI such a game changer, and what does the latest research tell us about how to leverage EI for long-term success? These are some of the powerful questions we're going to be asking in this short hour that we have together. So let's dig in. So when people hear the term emotional intelligence, they often think of it as just being in touch with our feelings or emotions or creating a more empathetic workplace. But today we're looking at it through a different lens, a brain science lens. And while this session isn't about teaching specific EI techniques, it's more focused on exploring the research behind EI and how it impacts and drives our leadership behaviors. So we will explore how the brain shapes our ability to operate under pressure, to make decisions, and to navigate uncertainty. And if I do my job well, you'll have a few aha moments along the way that are going to help you better understand your own leadership behaviors. We're also going to discuss why EI is becoming a must-have set of skills in the AI era, and those key abilities of being able to adapt, to think strategically, to manage complex relationships across the organization is what's going to set leaders apart and give organizations that strategic edge when navigating all the ambiguity that's ahead of us. I also want to blow up the stigma around the words emotional intelligence. Any term that has the word emotional in it tends to connotate kumbaya sessions where we're all in the room talking about feelings and emotions. Yikes. But what we're going to do is use that lens of neuroscience to look at what happens in our brains and make those connections to how that impacts how we behave with others and how we make decisions and how we remain agile and resilient as the workplace changes around us. So, my goal at the end of this session is for you to connect the dots between EI and brain science and leadership effectiveness, and to understand steps that you can take to develop EI skills in yourself and in leaders and team members in your organization. Lastly, we'll explore some common missteps or pitfalls that happen for organizations when they attempt to train those EI skills and how you can avoid them to ensure that you're really optimizing your leadership development efforts as you work on cultivating those key skills. So, we're going to be covering a lot of ground in an hour. As we mentioned in our opening, AI is revolutionizing financial services, automating things like fraud detection, conducting risk assessments, making processes more efficient, helping us reduce errors. But here's the challenge: AI doesn't eliminate uncertainty, it actually introduces new complexities for us to navigate. So, for example, AI can help us identify risks, but who determines how we respond to those risks? AI can forecast market trends, but who decides the strategy and where we're going to go? AI can even automate some client interactions, but who ensures that our relationships with our clients and customers are built on trust and credibility and building loyalty? So, this is where leadership comes in. The leaders who really thrive aren't those who simply know how AI works and use it. They're the ones who know how to strike that right balance between how we integrate AI with human judgment, how, for example, we balance our use of data with context and intuition and influence. So, as AI is changing how we work, it's also shining a spotlight on the leadership skills that remain uniquely human. I'll be sharing additional research with you that makes the case for why your emotional intelligence skills will be a key differentiator for you as an individual leader, and why organizations should also be paying more attention to cultivating these skills in their leaders and their workforce. So McKinsey and Company projects that 24% of financial services jobs are going to be automated by 2030. And their research is showing that while automation is replacing some tasks, the need for that people-centered leadership is actually increasing. And the demand for these social and emotional intelligence skills is growing at a much faster pace than the need for cognitive skills. Now, both are important, of course, but the World Economic Forum's Future of Jobs report has identified that emotional intelligence, adaptability, and complex problem solving are some of the most sought after skills for the future workforce. And this shift isn't just happening in the financial services sector, it's really happening across all industries. So we all know people who are incredibly smart, but they tend to struggle in their leadership roles. And we also may know people who may not be the smartest people in the room, but they really know how to handle pressure, they know how to navigate change, and they know how to influence and bring out the best in others. They always seem to be the ones figuring out how to move things forward. That's because our brain is wired in a way that can either help us or hurt us under pressure. If we don't develop emotional intelligence skills, our brains can actually work against us. So let's take a peek at the science of what's actually happening in our brains when emotions start to take over and what those critical emotional intelligence skills really are. So, as we move into the science of EI and how our brain influences our leadership behaviors, I want to take just a minute to talk about IQ versus EQ, or emotional intelligence versus personality, and which of these tend to be fixed versus which are responsive to change. We often hear about IQ as a measure of intelligence. It's our ability to analyze and process information, to solve problems, but IQ is actually relatively fixed. So, research shows that while we can gain skill and knowledge, our raw cognitive abilities, such as our processing speed and our memory, doesn't change a whole lot after childhood. So whenever I talk about IQ being fixed, people always come up and challenge me and say, well, Tracy, I feel like I've learned so much. I've got so many new skills and knowledge. Well, we do accumulate new skills and knowledge as we go through life, but that innate IQ or our raw cognitive ability, again, tends to stay fairly fixed. The same goes for our personality. Whether you're naturally analytical or intuitive, whether you're a natural introvert or extrovert, your core traits remain relatively stable through your life. Now, you might refine how you present yourself or learn that you need to bring out certain behaviors to be more effective, but your fundamental personality does not shift very dramatically. So, for example, if I'm really introverted and not very social, and those are my comfort behaviors, as I go through my career, I might learn that I need to make a conscious effort to make connections with others and to build relationships in order to be successful. And I can do that, but I'm essentially overriding my innate personality traits or comfort behaviors, and I'm developing learned behaviors without really changing my core personality traits of remaining introverted. Emotional intelligence, however, is different. Unlike IQ and personality, EI is a skill. It's one that can be strengthened over time through experience and practice and brain training. And here's the key: EI is not something that you just have or you don't. The brain is constantly rewiring itself through neuroplasticity, and the ability to strengthen those neural pathways through repetition and habit really can help change the way our brain operates. So, just like we can train a muscle, we can train our brains to become more emotionally intelligent. But the term itself can feel really broad and vague. So before we go any further, let's take a moment just to define emotional intelligence, because it isn't just one skill. It's really a combination of abilities that shape how we lead, how we communicate, how we make decisions. And breaking it down a bit will help us connect those dots between EI and the leadership behaviors that can really drive impact. So, again, emotional intelligence is a term that's used in different ways, but at its core, it's really about how effectively we understand and manage ourselves and how we navigate and influence our relationships with others. So, there's multiple frameworks for defining emotional intelligence. What you're seeing on screen is Dr. Travis Bradbury's model, and it highlights four key components of self awareness. And I call this the foundation of EI. It's our ability to recognize our emotions as they happen, to understand how they influence our behavior and how we operate, and to get that accurate sense of our strengths and our opportunity areas. And really, without self awareness, we can't regulate our responses effectively, which is the next component of EI. It's that self management piece. So we're aware of our emotions. The next step is, how do we manage them? This includes things like impulse control, being able to stay composed under pressure if somebody says something terse to us in a meeting. It's also things like, how can we be adaptable? So it's about responding intentionally rather than reacting emotionally. That's our self management skills. Social awareness is about our ability to read the room, to recognize social dynamics, to understand what other people around us might be experiencing. So, empathy plays a huge role here. It allows us to pick up on those unspoken cues and anticipate how people might be feeling or how our messages are coming across to others and how we're being perceived. The last component of relationship management, this is where EI moves into action. So it's our ability to use our self awareness, our self management, and our social awareness to make constructive connections with others, to build trust, and to communicate effectively and influence others. So there are a variety of EI models out there. Another famous name is Daniel Goleman, and there's some slight differences in the various frameworks out there, but they really focus on essentially the same capabilities. It's our ability to recognize and regulate our mindset and emotions, understand others, and build constructive relationships. And these skills don't just matter in leadership or in business. EI influences how we operate every day in our personal lives as well, including how well we manage our stress and how we manage our personal and our family relationships as well. So, EI is a pretty broad superpower that has carryover across our personal and professional lives. So, we're going to do a quick poll. I'm going to ask you to participate via polling today. And you can do that by taking out your smartphone and read that QR code. It will pop up our polling site. So, that's probably the quickest and easiest way to access our polls. But if you would prefer to participate in the polls via a browser, you can go to pollev.com / Aspire Talent, and that will pull up our polling. I'll ask you to please go ahead and stay in the polling site once you're in there because we will do a few polls throughout the session today. So this is our first one. I'll give you just a moment to pull that up again by scanning the QR code or going to that URL in your browser. And in just a moment, we will go ahead and show the first poll. Okay, there we go. What aspect of emotional intelligence do you find most challenging as a leader? So, managing your own emotions under pressure is the first one, reading others' emotions effectively, building trust and psychological safety, or staying adaptable and making sound decisions under stress. Okay, it looks like that first one. Yes, you are not alone. All right, managing emotions under pressure. Yeah, that is a key EI skill. Okay, thank you so much for participating in that. So, I'm going to make a bold claim here. Emotional intelligence is the foundation for nearly every leadership competency that matters. So, let me ask you this. Think about the best leader you ever worked for. What made them really effective? Were they just technically skilled, or did they really know how to motivate, inspire, and bring out the best in others? Now think about the worst leader you've ever worked with and what made them ineffective. Was it a lack of knowledge, or did they tend to struggle with communication, or perhaps emotional control, or navigating team dynamics, or interpersonal dynamics? Chances are the difference between the best and worst leaders that you've worked with wasn't their IQ, or their industry knowledge, or their job title, or their role specific knowledge. It was their ability to lead, engage, and connect with people. Because leadership is not just about what you know, it's about how you apply it under pressure, how you interact, and how you make complex decisions in unpredictable situations. So, we need emotional intelligence skills to be effective at things like problem solving and decision making, to innovate, to think strategically. We need good EI skills in order to be a good coach, to motivate and develop our team members, to give and receive feedback effectively, and to have those difficult conversations that none of us really look forward to. We need those EI skills to navigate ambiguity and uncertainty, to stay agile and resilient in times of disruption. So, when we develop emotional intelligence, we aren't just improving one aspect of leadership, we're really strengthening the foundation of all of our other leadership skills. And the research backs this up. Studies show that EI is one of the strongest predictors of leadership success, influencing everything from employee engagement to business performance. So, the key takeaway is if we want to build stronger leaders, we have to start with EI. It's not just one skill, it's a set of skills that serve as a foundation for our other leadership skills. So that's why when I'm working with companies and we're designing leadership development programs, I always recommend starting with emotional intelligence really as that first component or that first topic to address. We sometimes call it the behavior science of leadership effectiveness instead of emotional intelligence to blow up that stigma around it, but it is the place to start when building out a leadership development program. So let's dive into a little bit of brain science. We've been talking about emotional intelligence as a critical leadership skill, but what's often overlooked is that EI is about how the brain drives our behaviors, our decision making, and our ability to lead effectively. So, we're going to highlight four key areas of the brain that play a powerful role in leadership and decision making. It's the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, the insular cortex, and the anterior cingulate cortex, or the ACC. So, these are regions of the brain that shape how we regulate emotions and process social information. And when we understand how these parts of our brain influence our behaviors, we can start to recognize patterns in things like how we react to stress, how we interpret different situations, and how we build relationships. And more importantly, we can learn to train our brains to respond more effectively. Now, I'll give you a quick sidebar because when I train EI, I always incorporate a lot of brain science, and people always come up and tell me how much they love the brain science and how did I learn so much about how the brain operates. Well, I had some really significant motivation to learn about brain science. So, uh, many years ago, when I was 42 years old and in perfect health, out of the blue one morning, I got up and I went crashing to the floor. And I couldn't move either side of my body. I could only move my head. And I couldn't figure out what was wrong. And I kept trying to stand up and I couldn't. Well, after about 20 minutes of trying, all of a sudden I was able to get up and one side of my body was hanging and the other worked. And I didn't know what had happened. And I just thought, well, one side seems to be asleep. It's time to go to work. And I turned to my dogs to say, hey, time to go outside. And it all came out complete nonsense words. I knew what I was trying to say, and what came out of my mouth was just um, garbly nonsense. So then I realized something was wrong and I needed to dial 911. And I went to the phone and was looking at all the buttons, and I knew what I was supposed to do. My brain is saying dial 911, but I couldn't make my body actually do it. So to make a long story short, I eventually was able to get through to 911. They asked me the address of the emergency. I knew it. I couldn't say it. It was all coming out nonsense words. And by the time they got me to the hospital and in the MRI machine, and realized I was having a very major stroke, we had missed the 3 hour window for administering the clot busting drug TPA. And the only option at that point was doing what was then a highly experimental surgery where they go up through your femoral artery into your brain to physically break up the clot. Had about a 25% mortality rate. So believe me, I thought twice about doing it. But the neurologist told me that there was significant damage and there would probably be some serious quality of life issues. And that was kind of a Hail Mary. So long story short, again, I took that Hail Mary. And even with that, they only gave me about a 25% chance of returning to normal functioning. And I just decided I was going to defy those odds. I was still young. I had a lot of life to live. I wasn't ready to hang it up. So I decided I was going to dig in and learn everything that I could about the brain and neuroplasticity, all as part of my recovery and trying to get back my brain function. So I was one of those geeks that ordered about 20 neuroscience books and sat down and immersed myself in it. And I had a lot of ahas because I had been working in team development and leadership development. And as I started to learn all the brain science, I started to see all of these amazing connections between how our brain operates and how that drives our behavior in the workplace. So it gave me this tremendous opportunity to marry brain science with leadership effectiveness and team effectiveness. So, quick sidebar on why I'm such a believer in brain science and how the understanding of that can really give us tremendous insights into our own behaviors and the dynamics of how people operate in the workplace. So, one of the most important regions for emotional intelligence is called the prefrontal cortex, and it's sometimes called the CEO of our brain. It's where our higher order thinking happens. So, things like reasoning, impulse control, problem solving, regulating our emotions. So, think of it this way: if our emotions were a car, the prefrontal cortex is really the driver. It decides when to hit the brakes, when to accelerate. And when it's active and engaged, leaders can stay composed under pressure and avoid some of those knee jerk reactions that can happen. But when it's underdeveloped or hijacked by stress, we tend to get into reactive decision making or emotional outbursts and poor impulse control, which obviously aren't ideal for leadership. So it's likely at some point in our careers we've all had to deal with somebody who perhaps struggled with some of those impulse control behaviors. Studies have found that in MRI scans that emotionally intelligent leaders actually show stronger activation in that prefrontal cortex when they're making high stakes decisions. So the good news is, like a muscle, that prefrontal cortex can be strengthened. So a few things we can do as a leader to strengthen that area. We can do what we call decision pre-mortem. So that is mentally rehearsing potential challenges before they happen. So it's kind of like playing out what if scenarios as you're going to make decisions and anticipating challenges and how you might handle them. And this actually builds stronger neural pathways for self regulation. Another tip to strengthen that area is to analyze past high pressure decisions where you may have let emotional reactions creep into your decision making, and identify what were some of those emotional triggers. I always suggest leaders reflect on who are those people or those types of situations that tend to trigger me or cause me to have that emotional reaction. And what does it feel like when I've actually been triggered? We want to pay attention to those somatic sensations in our bodies when we've been triggered. So, for example, I tend to tighten up my shoulders. Some people say they feel their face getting warm or they feel their heart start pounding. So, however you experience it, you want to be able to recognize what those sensations are. So, you recognize when you've been triggered and that you're having a emotional response to something. And that gives you the opportunity to engage a strategy such as just taking a pause and taking a deep breath. Even a 6-second pause before reacting is a technique that's often used by military and crisis leaders, and it gives that prefrontal cortex the time to override that emotionally driven reaction and make a more intentional choice. So leaders often ask me when I train emotional intelligence, how do I stop myself from having these emotional reactions? And I say, I'm sorry, I have bad news for you. You're not going to be able to stop yourself from having emotional reactions. But the key emotional intelligence skill is to be able to recognize when we're having an emotional reaction. And instead of just operating out of that lower brain and having something fly out of our mouth that we may later regret, the emotional intelligence skill is being able to feel that, pause, interrupt it, and still choose a constructive response moving forward. So you're really engaging that prefrontal cortex as you're learning how to do that. So, as we explore the brain and emotional intelligence, keep in mind that the strongest leaders aren't the ones that suppress the emotions. They're the ones who learn how to regulate them effectively. And it all starts with that prefrontal cortex. Then we move on to the amygdala, which is our built in alarm system for the brain. It's constantly scanning for threats, it's triggering these emotional reactions, and it's fast. It happens fast, and our rational brain doesn't really have time to catch up. So that's why when something stressful happens, whether it's a tense conversation or an unexpected challenge, we feel the emotion first, and then our logical rational brain kicks in later. So in what's called an amygdala hijack, the brain perceives a threat and instantly it floods our body with stress hormones, things like cortisol and adrenaline. So we start to experience things in our body like our heart rate spiking and our breathing increases and our blood pressure increases and our perspiration increases. And at the same time, our digestion slows down and our blood is redirected to the muscles. So essentially, it is our body preparing for flight or fight or flight. And this response is really automatic. It's designed to keep us alive in life threatening situations. But in the workplace where the threat comes from, it's just often an email or a difficult conversation or an unexpected change. So this amygdala hijack reaction can actually work against us. Another thing we know about amygdala hijack is that it essentially is driven out of the lower brain. And again, our logical, rational brain, our ability to apply logic and reasoning really declines significantly when our amygdala is engaged. So it can drop by up to 80%, that ability to be reasonable and logical and rational. So it makes it hard to think clearly. So it takes about 20 minutes after this has been engaged for all of that adrenaline and that cortisol to start to calm down. But it's important to understand what happens in our bodies when we're having amygdala hijack. Again, our EI skills are about recognizing when we're in that state and being able to interrupt the amygdala's panic response. So even asking yourself the question, am I in lower brain right now or higher brain? Lower brain is instinctive reactions. Higher brain is logic and reasoning. So just asking the question, am I in lower brain or higher brain, can help shift you into higher brain. It's trying to get you into metacognition, which we will talk about in just a moment. So the good news is the more we practice these techniques, the stronger that connection between our amygdala and our prefrontal cortex. So the next part of the brain that impacts our leadership behaviors, if you've ever walked into a room and immediately sensed tension in the room before anybody even said a word, or you've had a conversation with somebody who said, "Oh, I'm fine," but their body language screamed something different, well, that's your insular cortex at work. And it's like the brain's built-in social radar. It picks up on subtle cues from micro expressions, or voice inflections. It helps us read the emotional climate of the room. So when it's active, leaders are better at picking up on unspoken concerns before they turn into real issues, adapting their communication, knowing when to push or pull or when to just listen, building trust and influence because they genuinely sense what people need, making their leadership feel more natural and authentic. So, neuroscience actually shows that leaders with strong emotional intelligence have greater insular cortex activation, meaning they're better at understanding their own emotions and others' emotions in real time. So again, just like the other parts of their brain, you can train your insular cortex just like a muscle. And practicing active listening, regularly seeking feedback, all enhance this part of the brain, sharpening your ability to read people. So if you've ever been told you have a sixth sense for what people are feeling, you can thank your insular cortex. That's where that comes from. And our last area to highlight is the anterior cingulate cortex, or we call it the ACC for short. So if brain regions had their own LinkedIn profiles, this area would be the rock star leader who can pivot strategies, stay cool under pressure, and catch problems before they even happen. So it's basically the brain's built-in crisis manager. It helps you with cognitive agility to be able to navigate uncertainty and control impulses and detect errors. So if you've ever had to change course mid-project or rethink a strategy or navigate through a messy situation, you can thank your ACC because it really helps you adjust on the fly. It's also your brain's mental pause button. So that moment where you're about to fire off an email that you probably shouldn't, that's your ACC telling you to hold up. It helps regulate your emotional reactions and prevent you from making snap decisions. And then there's decision making and risk management. And the ACC is constantly helping you balance logic and emotion, making sure that you don't get swept away just by gut instinct. And then conflict and error detection. It's one of the most underrated leadership skills. Your ACC is always scanning for inconsistencies, spotting potential biases, and helping you course correct before things go off the rails. So, like other areas we discussed, you can actually train your ACC. One technique is to do those decision simulations. So, the more your ACC is exposed to uncertainty, the better it gets at managing it. So, as people navigate a lot of change in their lives, they tend to get better at it. That is your ACC that's learning. It's analyzing past decisions, and it's learning from these mentally complex situations and building those neural connections that allow you to think ahead and again react with intention versus emotion. So if you've ever wished you could stay cooler in a crisis or shift gears more easily or just make sharper decisions, this is the area of the brain where it all starts. So we've introduced key areas of the brain and how they influence some of our leadership effectiveness. Let's focus a little bit on decision making. Each leader makes thousands of decisions every day, from setting strategy to handling crisis, and decision making can feel exhausting, literally. Neuroscientists have found that every choice that we make depletes glucose in our prefrontal cortex. So the more decisions we make, the more drained the systems becomes. And we can feel it by the end of the day, right? Our ability to think clearly or make good decisions really can drop significantly. We've all felt that decision fatigue. So the concept was studied by psychologist Roy Baumeister, and he found judges are more likely to deny parole later in the day when their mental energy is depleted. People make poor financial decisions in the evening when their self-control is lower. And you've probably heard the famous story about Steve Jobs, how he wore the same black turtleneck every day because he wanted to eliminate trivial decisions and preserve his brain power for the really important ones. So as a leader, you don't get the luxury of skipping decisions, but uh, leaders with high EI, they recognize when their mental energy is running low and they adjust, and that helps keep them from making those impulsive choices. So decision fatigue, though, isn't the only challenge. We are faced with just an overwhelming amount of data that we encounter each day, and our brains rely on mental shortcuts. So, patterns that help us make quick decisions without over analyzing every detail. And these shortcuts are called cognitive biases, and they shape our decisions without us even realizing it. So, even the smartest leaders aren't immune to cognitive bias. In fact, the more stressed or tired or overworked you are, the more likely you are to default to some of these biases. So the best leaders don't try and eliminate them. That's impossible. Instead, we train our brains to recognize these biases creeping into our decision making before it happens so we can kind of catch ourselves. So there are so many cognitive biases, but let's first ask you again in the poll, how often do you actively reflect on how your emotions influence your leadership decisions? So when we think about decision making, we're often thinking, we're using strategies for how to make decisions, but how often do you reflect on what impact your emotions have on your decision making? Okay, good. All right. So we've got some saying, yep, every day. Some of you saying occasionally. A few saying rarely, you rely more on logic and strategy. Okay. Thank you for weighing in. So, cognitive biases are those blind spots in our thinking, and they trick us into making bad decisions while feeling like we're making good ones. And there's a lot of them out there, but we're going to focus on the four worst offenders. So, confirmation bias is the first one. I'm sure you've heard of this one before. It's our brain's tendency to seek out and prioritize information that supports what we already believe while ignoring information that contradicts our beliefs. So, as an example, if you, as a manager, you're convinced that a new hire is going to be a rock star. So, in the first few months, you're noticing every small win, such as they spoke up in a meeting, they handled a project well. You're noticing all the things that confirm your belief that this person's a rock star. But when their performance starts slipping, you might brush it off, saying, oh, they're just adjusting. So, this happens all the time in management where, again, we're paying attention to things that really confirm the beliefs that we have. So, another bias is Dunning-Kruger. And this is a bias where people with low expertise tend to overestimate their abilities, while those with high expertise tend to underestimate their competence. So, imagine a brand new manager of a department who's convinced that they can come into a team that's really struggling and they can turn it around in 90 days. And they've never led a team before, but they figure, hey, I've just read a great article or a great book on management and now I'm convinced, how hard can it be? And they walk in overconfident, and before you know it, reality hits and they find themselves over their heads. That is the Dunning Kruger effect in action. It's when somebody lacks the knowledge to realize how much they don't know. Perhaps you're thinking about some people that you've interacted with that perhaps are have this cognitive bias. They overestimate their abilities because they don't necessarily have enough experience or knowledge to see the complexity of what they're facing. So, true expertise comes with understanding not just what you know, but also what you don't know. The next cognitive bias that's common is called sunk cost fallacy. And so this is the tendency to keep investing in a failing decision just because we've already put resources in it. So imagine that you've been trying to develop an employee for over a year and you've had coaching conversations, you've sent them to training, you've reassigned some of their work, and they're still not delivering results. Instead of moving on, you might have the tendency to like double down on your efforts to try and make it work. Why? Because you've already invested so much time and you don't want to quit. So, this is an example of sunk cost fallacy. It means we may do things like keep an underperforming employee too long because we've spent those months trying to develop them. We might hold on to a broken system or a process because it took so much effort to implement. Or we might refuse to scrap an initiative that clearly isn't working because it feels like we will have wasted the time and money spent. Lastly, a common bias is anchoring bias. And so this is the tendency to rely heavily on the first piece of information we get, even when better information comes later. And it creeps into our decisions in all kinds of ways. I worked for an organization and there was a leader, a lot of managers were trying to get resources from this one leader. And it became known that if you need something, you better be the first one that gets to him because once he hears your case and decides you're going to get a resource, he won't listen to anybody else's other case. So this is a good example again of anchoring bias, and it does creep into our decision making. So, how do we outsmart those biases? Well, it starts with metacognition, the ability to think about our own thinking. The best leaders don't just trust their gut, they challenge it. So, when they're faced with a decision, they pause to ask, what biases might be influencing my decision here or my choice? Am I anchoring to the first piece of information? Am I dismissing data that contradicts what I already believe? Even this simple act of questioning our automatic responses forces our brain to engage in that higher level reasoning. And research backs it up. Journal of Behavioral Decision Making found that leaders who actively develop emotional intelligence reduce bias related decision errors by 32%. And that's because emotional intelligence, especially that self awareness and impulse control, keep us from rushing into decisions based on those flawed assumptions. So, neuroscientists, again, studying decision making, found that when we engage in self reflection, it'll activate that prefrontal cortex and it'll help override some of those emotional responses. So, just being aware that cognitive biases can seep into our decision making is important. And stress and uncertainty can add another layer. So, stress and uncertainty don't just feel overwhelming, they actually rewire our brain. So when pressure spikes, our brain goes into survival mode and we start prioritizing action over rational thought. And it's because cortisol and adrenaline are flooding into our system. And it's why under pressure, we're more likely to make these reactive decisions. So this can be dangerous for leaders. And there's some good research around how chronic stress doesn't just affect decision making in the moment, but over time, it actually shrinks the gray matter in the prefrontal cortex, weakening our ability to regulate our emotions and to think long term. So, there's some research from Stanford that shows that even just reframing stress as a challenge rather than a threat helps change our response to it. So, physiology also plays a role. Things like deep breathing can activate that vagus nerve and counteract our heart rate and some of the physiological things that happen when we're under stress. So we know stress and uncertainty are inevitable, but great leaders don't let it dictate their decisions. They stay aware of how stress impacts their thinking and they engage strategies to ensure that they're keeping that prefrontal cortex engaged. So we've highlighted areas of brain science and behavioral science behind EI. Let's zoom out a little bit and examine some studies that demonstrate why EI is really a game changer for leadership success. But first, we'll do a quick poll about leadership skills in your organization. So when you think about the most undervalued leadership skill in your organization, what would you say that would be? Okay. Okay, a little bit of everything here. So empathy and relationship building, adaptability. All right, our winner is empathy and relationship building. Oops, nope, changing it. Oh, pretty well balanced. All right, thank you for weighing in. So, for decades, we've prioritized IQ and technical expertise as the standard for leadership. But the reality is shifting. In the age of AI, technical skills aren't enough anymore. A Talent Smart study found that EI accounts for about 58% of leadership performance, making it a stronger predictor of success than IQ or technical expertise. So, while technical knowledge may get somebody through the door, it's really their ability to manage emotions and build relationships that can lead to longer term success. So, in financial services, high EI leaders significantly outperform their peers. So, there was a study again in Journal of Applied Psychology. Teams with emotionally intelligent managers saw higher productivity, lower turnover, and stronger collaboration. And 90% of top performers scored high in EI, while only 20% of low performers do. So that's a pretty big gap. McKinsey also shows that companies with high EI leaders have a 28% increase in team performance. And the World Economic Forum ranks EI as one of the top leadership skills for 2025 and beyond. So AI can predict market trends, but it can't navigate client relationships, coach employees, or handle high stakes decision making with nuance. So the research is clear to really thrive in an AI world. Those who can leverage technology but balance it with leading with emotional intelligence will thrive. So, when you think about your industry specifically, financial service professionals navigate high stakes conversations every day. And there's a study showing banking and wealth management professionals with high EI drive better client satisfaction and retention. So, this is essentially making the case for you as individual leaders why these EI skills are critical to build. There was some interesting research in a Talogy white paper highlighting trends in emotional intelligence across various sectors, including financial services. And overall, financial service industry professionals tended to score a little bit lower on things like interpersonal EI, particularly things like awareness of others, emotional expression, and self management. So, the financial service professionals demonstrated strengths, though, in some areas like self management or emotional resilience or goal directedness. It also found out that EI tends to increase with age. So you'll notice on the graph that, particularly in that 40 to 49 age group, you see those EI skills start to spike up, aligning with that idea that EI skills really can develop through experience. It also tends to develop through increased job seniority, so particularly in leadership skills, suggesting that those who advance through the organization tend to develop those stronger EI skills over time. Also, a strong connection between EI and high performing teams. A lot of you might have heard of that study by Google, Project Aristotle, where they analyzed over 180 teams trying to figure out what made them high performing. And they determined that the strongest predictor wasn't intelligence or technical expertise, it was psychological safety. And that means team members feel secure enough to take risks and admit mistakes and engage in constructive debate without fear or embarrassment. And what drives that? Emotional intelligence. So lots of studies around this that teams led by high EI managers tend to perform 30% better. They have 35% lower turnover. And EI is contagious. Employees are 4 times more likely to develop emotional intelligence skills when their managers are demonstrating it. So at the end of the day, technical skills and intelligence matter, but they're not enough for high performing teams and the ability to cultivate psychological safety. We need those emotional intelligence skills. So EI isn't just a buzzword, it's a measurable predictor. So again, we're making that case and giving you some of the research and data behind it. High EI leaders handle crisis 40% more effectively. They're 31% better at managing stakeholder resistance. They generate higher financial returns. They navigate disruption and transformation with 30% better outcomes. And Center for Creative Leadership found that 75% of career derailments are due to low emotional competence or interpersonal struggles, failure to adapt. I know I work with a lot of leaders, I do coaching, and when a company comes to me and says, we have this leader we want you to work with, they're really good at their job, but they're kind of a stinker to work with. They're not good at developing those relationships. So it's often those interpersonal skills that are standing in our way. So, resilience and agility are another part of emotional intelligence. And leaders who can master agility, 40% more effective in decision making, and companies led by adaptable leaders, 30% better outcomes during disruption. So, we're really making that research backed case for why emotional intelligence skills are important to you as a leader. There's also this thing called mirror neurons, and we've all experienced it where we walk in a room and tension is really thick and we can feel it. Mirror neurons are the brain cells that are responsible for social connection, and they cause us to absorb the emotions of others around us. And it's called emotional contagion. So it's the phenomena where emotions spread within a group. So if a leader stays composed under pressure, their team's more likely to stay clear-headed. And it's not just about what they say, it's about those micro moments where they're adjusting their vocal tone or their pacing or their body language. So, mastering emotional transmission is essential. Leaders who harness that awareness can really help shape team dynamics and trust and performance at a deep neurological level. So, it's by managing their own responses, they're influencing the culture around them. And we've talked about why emotional intelligence is essential for individual leaders, but it's also important for organizations. Organizations that prioritize EI and leadership development aren't just building better managers, they're creating a future proof workforce. So here's just a few of the statistics because we wanted to give you the research behind why we should care about EI. You'll notice there's a lot of studies up here. Organizations that invest in EI gain that competitive edge in innovation, adaptability. Leaders with high EI adapt to industry change 25% faster. Organizations with high EI leaders, 50% better retention and customer loyalty. Harvard Business Review, EI trained leaders had a 35% higher productivity and 30% less workplace conflict. So again, we wanted to give you some of the research behind and science behind why EI is such a compelling competency for leaders that organizations want to pay attention to moving forward. EI also has a strong connection to innovation. And it isn't just about having great ideas, it's about creating an environment where those ideas can take shape and succeed. So, research shows high EI teams are 3 times more likely to generate disruptive innovations, 2 times more likely to sustain long term growth, and are more effective at things like cross functional collaboration and problem solving and product development. So, the takeaway is that companies that dominate the next decade aren't the ones that are only investing in technology, they're the ones also embedding emotional intelligence into their leadership DNA. So we've covered a lot of ground with what emotional intelligence is. We've backed it up with brain science and research and studies and looked at how cognitive bias and stress response shape our decision making and our leadership effectiveness. We've made the case that technical skills and IQ alone aren't enough. Then we zoomed out, we took a bigger picture at why organizations should care about cultivating EI in their leaders and what some of those hard numbers and metrics are around why EI is such an important skill. So, organizations invest in training, but without the right approach, leaders often struggle to apply their EI skills in meaningful ways. So, there's some common mistakes that we see organizations make. So, let's do a quick poll. I'm going to ask you what the biggest barrier is to strengthening emotional intelligence in your workplace. This is our final poll. What's the biggest barrier to strengthening emotional intelligence in your workplace? All right. Okay. It looks like the biggest one at the moment is leaders don't get real feedback on how they show up emotionally. Okay, good. Thank you. So, the first mistake I see is assuming that EI is fixed versus trainable. So, there's a lot of research around how leaders who engage in structured EI development programs see big improvements in their decision making quality and their reduction in stress related errors and increases in their leadership effectiveness. So things are happening in the brain, and training EI skills goes beyond stress management. There are neuroscientific studies that show that EI training actually strengthens that connection between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. So you're really training leaders to reduce those stress-driven emotional responses. And MRI scans are showing the physical effects of EI training. EI trained individuals develop that denser gray matter in the brain's self-regulation centers. So the bottom line is it's like going to the gym and strengthening your muscles. EI training really strengthens those neural circuits that drive leadership success, and the brain is very adaptable. We can train it to be smarter and make better, resilient decisions. Another mistake we see is that too often leaders or organizations treat EI training as a one time event, a single workshop, a leadership retreat, or an online module, and they expect that leaders walk away with lasting behavior change. But we know the brain isn't designed to transform habits overnight. There's research that shows after a single EI training session, 90% of leaders revert to old behaviors within 30 days. And that's because behavior change isn't about acquiring knowledge, it's about rewiring those neural pathways through repetition and application. And it's why reinforcement matters. The brain retains information best when learning is spaced out over time. And Harvard Business Review found companies that use ongoing reinforcement see 60% higher retention rates in their leadership training. So we know that piling too much information on at once in a single session leads to rapid forgetting. Neuroplasticity tells us that lasting behavior change requires repeated practice. So what's the solution? We think the right approach, and research shows this, that EI programs can't be just single workshops. They need to be multi component learning experiences. So, we've built, for example, programs for clients that ensure that ongoing learning and application. And often includes things like an initial benchmarking assessment, a structured debrief with a coach, follow up or activities in between sessions, and then even peer learning or coaching after the session. And it's Journal of Learning and Memory found that skills are retained 400% longer when you take the time to build in multiple reinforcement components like this. A third mistake, I think, is skipping a diagnostic. So, building educational programs around EI training can be helpful, but without a clear baseline, leaders don't always know what to improve, or worse, they think they don't need to improve at all. So, research backs up that 60 to 70% of leaders overestimate their EI skills. So, when leaders think they're already strong in emotional intelligence, they tend to disengage from the training, and the impact is kind of minimal. So, when EI training includes an assessment or diagnostic of some kind, leaders improve their self awareness by about 25% more than those just in general EI programs without assessment. So, leadership effectiveness can increase by 33% when EI training includes that personalized feedback. That's a Center for Creative Leadership study. So, EI assessment ensures that development efforts are focused and personal. Here's just a quick snapshot of one of the EQ diagnostics we use. It's called the EQI 2.0. It comes in a self-report, and it helps a leader benchmark their EI skills across different areas like self-perception, self-expression, their interpersonal skills, their decision-making, and their stress management. So it really gives them that objective benchmark to start with, where they can really see where their strength areas are and where some of their opportunity areas are. It's also important to pair it with coaching debriefs, and those can really increase skill application by about 40%, is what the research shows. Leaders who receive coaching after an assessment are 50% more likely to apply what they learn. And there's also much more sustained behavior change when you include coaching. So it just looks like leaders taking the diagnostic assessment and then having a debrief session where a coach can walk them through their results, where they understand how to interpret it, and they can set some development goals around it. The last pitfall I'll highlight is making emotional intelligence too abstract and vague, and I call it fluffy. And I always say we need to cut the fluff. So, traditional training tends to focus on personality styles or traits rather than really focusing on the brain science behind our emotional intelligence skills. So, again, we've got the research showing that EI training that focuses on abstract concepts versus brain based approaches is much less effective. So, when we can link EI training to understanding the brain science behind it and get away from the fluff of using it to talk about styles and personality traits and, and make it based on cognitive science, it tends to be better embraced, and leaders can see that connection more clearly between how their brain drives their leadership effectiveness and behavior. It's also one last tip, great to learn EI skills with your peers. Leaders tend to retain the information better when they're in a room with their peers. Some organizations mix leaders with individual contributors, and it just creates a different feeling. There's a little bit less safety in talking about some of the challenges that leaders face. It reduces some of the openness in the training room, and we're really seeing better results, greater skill retention, and faster integration of EI skills when leaders are learning with their peers. So, as we wrap up, again, we've covered a lot of ground and we've explored how, in the world being transformed by AI, emotional intelligence is a critical leadership competency. It isn't a nice to have. We've highlighted common mistakes in EI development, from ineffective training approaches to lack of reinforcement. So, as we wrap up, let's be clear, the future of leadership isn't about who knows the most, it's about who leads the best. And AI is going to handle the data and automate processes, but it's never going to replace that ability to inspire, connect, and engage with the people around us. Your ability to lead with emotional intelligence won't just set you apart, it will elevate your leadership, strengthen your team, and drive the long term success of your organization. Trinity, I'll turn it over to you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Tracy. That was incredible. Of course, I always love listening into your sessions when we do them for clients. So, thank you so much for joining us today. I
Thank
also
you.
want to let everyone here know that we are here and ready to help your team members and your organization with emotional intelligence training and development. And as you all witness here today, Tracy's phenomenal. She has a great insight of knowledge. I know a lot of the information shared today, it was a lot, and it'll be great to kind of be able to go back through that. So don't forget, we will be sending the recording of this out. But I would love to touch base with anybody interested in learning more about this opportunity and learning more about emotional intelligence and how we might be able to support their organization. My email is in this slide, and I look forward to further exploring opportunities with your organization. Well, we have time for one quick question, Tracy, before I think we'll see, before we hit the 1 o'clock Central Standard Time. So let's see, how do we help leaders who may be skeptical about emotional intelligence training to see its value? And how do we get them to realize it is about more than just being nice?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I think I had mentioned during the webinar that, just the word emotional intelligence tends to have connotations about emotions and feelings and kumbaya. And it can kind of dissuade people from wanting to develop their emotional intelligence skills. So, I mean, one of the little tricks we do is we talk about it as the behavior science of leadership, right? And we showed a lot of the data, and I think part of getting buy-in is sharing some of the research and data on why these are critical skills. And if the word emotional intelligence doesn't resonate in your organization, then call it the brain science of leadership or the behavior science of leadership. But there is research and data that will show the value, and sometimes it's just how we talk about emotional intelligence. When we talk about it from a place of brain science and behavior science, people tend to be a little bit more about open to embracing it.
Yeah, that sounds great. And I can say that that's true. When I work with clients, that definitely resonates within different organizations. Well, we are at the 1 o'clock hour, so I want to thank everyone so much, especially Tracy, for leading this discussion today. Look forward to hearing from any individuals who might be interested in learning more about how they can bring this into their organization. Make it a great day, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.